Hey folks, tonight we step into the flickering glow of oil lamps, past cool stone columns, and into the depths of an ancient Egyptian temple. Imagine warm desert air outside, but within cool shadows and the low murmur of sandals brushing polished floors. We're following the footsteps of a Greek statesman named Solon, who comes not for gold, not for glory, but for answers. Answers about a world swallowed by the sea. Drop your location and local time in the comments. We're all here together. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The city of Sais lay hushed in late afternoon light, its pale walls gleaming like ivory under the Egyptian sun. Solon, an Athenian lawmaker, poet, and philosopher, had traveled far. His feet were sore, his toga dusted from desert roads, but his mind was alight with purpose. He wasn't here for trade or treaties. No, Solon had come to Egypt in search of something far older, the true memory of humankind. Through winding corridors of the Temple of Neith, whose origins the priests claimed stretched back thousands of years, he was guided with reverent silence. Solon couldn't help but notice the way even time seemed to hold its breath inside those sacred halls. Columns painted in blue and gold towered overhead. Friezes lined with crocodiles, ibis-headed gods, and winged discs gazed down like ancient judges. The scent of myrrh and cedar clung to the air-sacred smoke that curled like memory itself. He was led into a cool chamber lit only by a few narrow slits of sun filtering through the stone. There, seated on a low dais carved with stars and waves, waited the high priest. The man was impossibly old, his skin parchment thin, his robe an ocean of white linen, but his eyes had not aged at all. They shimmered with that deep, unreadable calm you only see in those who have watched civilizations come and go. "Welcome, son of Helios," the priest said in flawless Greek, his voice as soft as dry papyrus. "You have come seeking truth. Are you prepared for how old it truly is?" Solon, ever the curious soul, gave a half-smile. "I am." The priest gestured for him to sit, and then without pomp, without parable, he began. "There was a time, long before your cities, before your poetry, before even the first of your myths, when a great civilization ruled beyond the pillars of Heracles." Solon leaned in. "You speak of a myth." The priest's eyes twinkled, though his mouth stayed grave. "You speak of a forgetting." From beneath a stone bench, the priest retrieved something wrapped in linen. It was a scroll old, brittle, its outer edges darkened with age. With surprising care for his thin fingers, the priest unrolled it across the stone floor. The characters etched into it were not in Greek, nor even Egyptian hieroglyph. They were older, stranger, written in symbols that pulsed with mystery. "This," he said, "was copied from the oldest temple of all, in the land before the first flood." Solon's brow furrowed. "Flood?" The priest nodded. "You Greeks remember Deucalion, do you not? And his ark? His hill of refuge?" "Of course," Solon said slowly. "A tale for children." "And yet," the priest replied, "here you sit in a temple thousands of years older than your oldest tale." A gust of hot wind passed through the slit windows, stirring the torchlight and throwing shadows across the scroll. Solon swallowed. "Are you saying your people remember a time before that flood?" "I am saying we remember many floods," said the priest, "and fire and ice and cities lost to all three." There was a silence. Solon felt oddly like a child at a hearth, listening to a grandfather speak of wars he could not imagine. The priest lifted his eyes. "You see, son of Athens, time is not a river but a tide. It comes and goes, pulls things under, leaves others dry. Most are drowned in forgetting. But here," he tapped the scroll, "gently some things are saved. And one of those things," Solon said carefully, "is Atlantis." The priest smiled, not warmly, not coldly, but like someone watching a candle finally catch fire. "You are not the first to ask," he said. but you may be the first ready to understand. And just like that, the story began. Not with a city, not with a king, but with memory, and with the strange, stubborn refusal of stone to forget. Solon could almost feel the temperature shift in the room. Or maybe it was his imagination. Still, goosebumps tickled his arms despite the Egyptian heat. Outside, a wind picked up, dragging sand across stone. Inside, the scroll lay open between them like a door, waiting to be stepped through. The priest continued in a voice low and steady, the way a storyteller speaks when he knows the listener will not sleep for a long time. He told Solon that what the Greeks called myth was often just memory made too vast, too strange for reason to accept. He told him that the temple had scrolls and vaults deeper than pyramids, records from before the Nile first bent toward the sea. And Solon listened, eyes wide, heart racing, trying to hold on to every word, every image, every flicker of understanding before it vanished like breath on a mirror. Later, he would say it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the sea, not the sea of water, but the sea of time. And from that sea, the priest was about to pull up something glittering, something heavy, something lost. The priest leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees, as if steadying himself before diving deeper into the well of memory. Solon didn't dare interrupt. He sensed knew that something ancient was uncoiling in the chamber between them, like a slow serpent awakened by the warmth of speech. This scroll, the priest murmured, was once kept in the sanctuary of Heliopolis before it was moved here. And before that, it was copied from even older tablets stored in the temple of the first time. What it contains, he said, touching the brittle edge gently, is not a story. It is a reckoning. Solon raised an eyebrow. A reckoning of what? Of the world as it was, said the priest, before your histories began. A slow smile tugged at the corners of Solon's mouth. You're going to tell me the earth is older than our poets believe? The priest chuckled softly. I will tell you the earth is older than your imagination permits. And in that age before your clocks and your coins, there were kingdoms vast beyond comprehension. Some we remember. Most, he tapped his head with a long, thin finger. Most we've forgotten, or buried, or drowned. He leaned forward. There was one kingdom, Solon, unlike any other, or not from the gods, but alongside them. And so, the priest unrolled a second layer of parchment beneath the first. The image was rough, faded, but unmistakable. A vast circle of land, surrounded by rings of water and more land, like ripples cast across the sea. This, the priest said, is the island that once sat beyond the pillars of Heracles, what your sailors now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Solon felt his throat go dry. You see, before the last great cataclysm, when the sky wept fire and the ocean swallowed whole cities, there was a civilization brilliant, radiant beyond imagining. A place where the temples were plated in orichalcum, where laws were carved not in stone, but in crystal, and where men flew not with wings, he added with a wink, but with reason. Solon tilted his head. That sounds like a fable. A fable, the priest replied gently. It's just a truth your people have forgotten how to carry. The scroll detailed things Solon had no words for. Engines turned by sunlight, towers that pulled water from the air, vast amphitheaters where thousands could listen to a single voice whispering on the wind. And in the heart of it all, a temple to Poseidon, god of the sea, whose golden statue stood so tall his trident pierced the clouds. They were not perfect, the priest added, but they were vast. Their knowledge stretched across the stars and into the depths of the earth. They knew things that even we have lost. But like all great things, their time came. Solon's brow furrowed. If they were so advanced, so powerful, how did they fall? The priest raised a finger. That, he said, comes later. First, you must understand what they were, or else their fall means nothing. He gestured to the symbol of the island once more. Atlantis was shaped by memory-concentric rings of land and water. The design wasn't ornamental. It was symbolic. The outer ring represented the body, the middle the mind, and the innermost the soul. At the center was their sacred heart. Not just their temple, but their entire reason for being. Solon leaned in. Which was? Balance, the priest said. Harmony between man, nature, and the divine. They called themselves the sons of Poseidon, not because they believed they were gods, but because they tried to live as if the sea's rhythm pulsed through their veins. He paused, and for a time, he whispered, they succeeded. The silence that followed was deep and oddly comforting, like the hush of a temple or the inside of a seashell. Solon shook his head. Why don't we remember this? How can a world so great just ... vanish? The priest gave him a look not unkind, but weary. You Greeks measure time like a child watches clouds. You see what is now, maybe what came before. But Egypt, he said, placing a hand on the stone beneath them, remembers. Because we built in stone, not wood. Because we passed our stories through temples, not taverns. Because we feared the gods enough to write their names down carefully, not shout them over wine. Solon chuckled despite himself. So we are children to you. You are, the priest said with a twinkle, but bright ones. Curious, loud, and occasionally wise. Solon bowed his head slightly. We're better with olives than with memory. Then let me offer you an olive branch, the priest said. Listen well, Solon, and carry what you hear back to your people, not as myth, but as memory returned. Outside the chamber, the sound of sandals echoed down the corridor acolytes, moving through their rituals, unaware that history was being unpacked like a sleeping god inside their walls. The priest stood, bones creaking slightly, and walked to a small alcove in the wall. From within, he withdrew a bundle of scrolls tied with braided flax and sealed with wax. These, he said, placing them before Solon, are copies, written in your tongue. They were made for one who never came. Who? Solon asked. A scholar from Ionia. He died at sea. But perhaps, he said softly, perhaps you were meant to receive them. Solon stared at the bundle. It looked harmless, small, like something you'd sling in a satchel for a long walk. But he already knew it weighed far more than it seemed. They will tell you of the golden laws, of the 10 kings, of the Great Canal, and the silver bulls. But they will also warn you. Atlantis was not lost because it was weak. It was lost because it forgot. Forgot what? The priest's face darkened. That harmony between flesh, mind, and spirit. The balance they worshipped. When pride grew heavier than wisdom, their island began to sink. A gust of wind rattled the temple walls. Or was that the earth, whispering agreement? Solon swallowed the lump in his throat. He'd come for knowledge. But now, it felt more like an inheritance, and not the kind that brings joy. As he carefully took the scrolls into his arms, the priest placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember, Solon, we Egyptians do not forget, but you Greeks, we hope you can learn. The shadows in the Temple of Sighs had lengthened since the priest began his tale, stretching like long fingers across the scroll-covered floor. Outside, the desert sun dipped lower, gilding the stone with soft amber, but inside, time felt suspended. The air hung still, as though even it had paused to listen. Solon sat perfectly still, the sacred scrolls at his side. He could feel their weight, not just physical, but intellectual, emotional, spiritual. He had come seeking ancient wisdom, but had not expected the past to be so vivid, so present. The priest, now seated once more before him, lifted a cup of cool water to his lips and resumed. You must understand something, Solon. Egypt remembers because we are a people of record. We carve into stone. We build for the ages. Our temples are time machines. He waved a hand at the towering pillars surrounding them. their capitals etched with lotuses, hawks, and suns. Each wall, he continued, each lintel and stair holds a story. The songs of gods, the rise of kings, the floods, the fires, the long shadows of loss. These we do not allow to vanish. Solon tilted his head. But surely even stone crumbles. The priest gave a soft chuckle. It does, but slower than parchment. Slower than rumor. Slower than man. He stood, gesturing for Solon to follow, and led him down a narrow hallway deeper into the temple's inner sanctum. The flickering flames of their handheld oil lamps painted the walls with dancing shadows. The corridor sloped downward, subtly but insistently, until the dry air cooled, tinged with mineral damp. Here, the priest said, was where true memory lived. They stopped at a sealed chamber door. With great care, the priest removed a bronze key from around his neck, its shape odd and organic, as though cast from coral or grown from root. He inserted it into a stone lock. It clicked softly, and slowly the great door rolled open, not on hinges, but on tracks carved directly into the rock. The room beyond was not large, but it hummed with presence. Carved directly into the walls were vast panels of pictographic text. Unlike the hieroglyphs of public temples, these were older, sharper, stranger. Symbols that seemed to curl inward, to spiral like galaxies. Solon stepped in, his breath shallow. The silence was complete. These records, the priest whispered, are not known to most even among our own. They are guarded by time, and by silence. He pointed to a great circular relief dominating the far wall. It depicted a sunken ringed city, submerged by waves, above which floated three symbols. One a radiant sun, one a star-shaped flower, and one a coiled serpent eating its own tail. Solon narrowed his eyes. I recognize the Ouroboros, he said, nodding at the serpent. But the flower? The priest smiled. The lotus of rebirth and the sun. Well, that is the fire from above. The one that both gave life to Atlantis and took it away. Solon turned to him slowly. Are you saying that Atlantis was destroyed by something celestial? The priest's voice was calm. We have records of fire raining from the sky. Not gods, not anger, just fire, great heat. A second sun. Whether it was a comet, a piece of the heavens broken loose, or something we still do not understand, something came down. He walked to the wall and traced the symbol of the flower. But the world does not end, he said gently. It changes shape, and sometimes those who live after cannot believe what came before. Solon ran his hand lightly over the carvings, their texture rough and cool beneath his fingers. He could feel time in them, the sort of time that doesn't tick, but waits. It was humbling. So Egypt, he murmured, was spared? Not spared, the priest said, but less broken. Our ancestors chose places where stone was strong and water flowed deep. Our gods, Thoth, Isis, Osiris, are not merely divine names. They are records, stories built into the land. Solon looked back at the great relief. And the Greeks forgot. The priest gave him a look not of pity, but of recognition. Because your world ended too, not in waves, but in fire and quake. And when the seas rose and the sky darkened, only a few survived. Enough to pass on tales, half-remembered, passed from parent to child in fear and whisper. Stories that became myths. That became bedtime tales. He smiled faintly. Until now. There was a moment where neither of them spoke. The weight of it all, thousands of years of remembering and forgetting, hung heavy in the air. And Solon asked quietly, how long ago did it happen? The priest stepped back toward the scrolls. Our reckoning places it around 9,000 years before your time. Before your heroes. Before Troy. Before even the first name was carved into a Greek stone. Solon blinked. 9,000? The priest nodded. Atlantis fell not recently, not during your parents' age, or even your gods. It fell before the world you know was born, when your ancestors were still hunting by torchlight. Solon exhaled, suddenly dizzy. It wasn't the number that overwhelmed him. It was the idea that human memory could stretch that far and still be dimmed. That something so magnificent could sink beneath the sea and, over the centuries, become nothing more than a half-smiled legend. He reached for the scrolls at his side. These will be laughed at in Athens, until your poets find beauty in them, the priest said. Until your philosophers find patterns. Until your people find loss familiar. He looked at Solon closely. You have the soul of a lawgiver, but the heart of a poet. You must carry this knowledge with both. Let it be your compass. Not a warning, a reminder. Solon nodded slowly, the echo of the words settling inside him like sand in still water. And deep beneath the temple of Sais, among stones carved in a language older than death, he began to understand something that even the cleverest philosophers of his age could not grasp. That the world had not just one history. It had layers. And Atlantis was just the deepest one we ever forgot. Back above ground, the temple's columns now glowed a dusky pink, kissed by the fading sun. The warm light spilled through the lattice of papyrus reeds just beyond the temple walls, painting the stone floor with gold-veined shadows. Solon followed the priest silently, his mind ablaze, replaying the spiral symbols, the ancient scrolls, the ringed city now sleeping beneath the sea. At last, they returned to the same quiet chamber where their journey had begun. The scrolls were once again laid gently upon the stone. Solon's hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped one. The ink had faded in places, but the script was precise. Elegant, clearly the work of someone who understood the sacred burden of transcription. The priest sat down with a groan, his old bones protesting the day's weight. He poured more water from a cool clay jug and offered some to Solon, who took it gratefully. The temple was silent now, save for the occasional soft coo of pigeons nesting somewhere in the rafters, as if even the birds were eavesdropping. You said earlier, Solon began slowly, that Atlantis was greater than any city we know, that it was shaped in rings to represent the body, the mind, and the soul. The priest nodded. Indeed, every ring served a purpose. Their city was an echo of their philosophy. Solon raised an eyebrow. And the center? The Sacred Heart, the priest said. A temple to Poseidon, their father god. But more than that, a place of stillness, of decision. From there, their kings ruled not with absolute power, but in harmony with the natural world. At least at first. Solon leaned forward. Tell me of the rulers. 10 kings, the priest said. Brothers, all descended from Poseidon, through a mortal woman named Cleito. The god had fallen in love with her and shaped the land around her, dwelling into the great city. He carved out the central island and enclosed it in rings of land and sea, each perfectly measured and made. He gestured toward the scroll again, where faint diagrams showed circular waterways and bridges connecting each zone, like spokes on a vast wheel. The kings ruled over 10 provinces, each ring or section radiating from the center like a petal. But all answered to the eldest Atlas, the firstborn, and his island bore his name. Atlantis, Solon murmured. So the land was named for a man? The priest nodded. Atlas was more than a man. His name, in our old tongue, means endurer, or the one who holds the heavens. It is both a name and a burden. The story unfolded with a richness that pulled Solon in deeper. The brothers each governed with a blend of ritual and reason. Laws were inscribed on orichalcum columns in the center temple, which gleamed red gold in the morning sun. Every 5 or 6 years, they gathered in the temple's sacred court, swearing oaths on the blood of bulls and deliberating on matters of justice. They were brilliant, the priest said, but not immortal, not infallible. Their success made them comfortable. Solon squinted. You mean prideful? The priest gave a slow nod. When you live in harmony with the world, there is peace. But when you begin to believe you own it, he let the thought trail off. Still, the early days of Atlantis, he said, were marked by astonishing prosperity. Their architecture was not only vast, but precise canals, bridges, and towers all aligned to the stars. Their ships were sleek, fast, guided by instruments long lost. Their knowledge of metals and alchemy surpassed even Egypt's most guarded secrets. They knew how to grow crops in salt water. They domesticated beasts, now extinct gentle giants with ivory tusks and intelligent eyes. Solon blinked. You speak of elephants? They had them in great herds, the priest confirmed. And in some places, they walked beside humans. Not in cages or chains, but in companionship. Solon gave a soft laugh. That would impress even our generals. It impressed your ancestors too, the priest said, until they forgot. There it was again, that quiet jab. The reminder that the Greeks, for all their cleverness, were still young in the eyes of the Nile. Solon sipped his water. And the buildings, they used a metal unknown to us? The priest's eyes twinkled. Orichalcum, harder than bronze, more brilliant than copper, but soft enough to shape. The city shone with it. Their temples were crowned in it. Their statues coated in it. Even their plumbing ran with pipes of it. And we have no trace of it today? Perhaps not above water, he said. But in the deep, in certain trenches, there are glimmers. Lost teeth of a drowned lion. Solon shook his head. It's almost too much to believe. That, said the priest softly, is how forgetting begins. He continued, Atlantis was not merely rich in wealth or invention. It had soul. Great libraries, open to all. Schools where geometry danced with poetry, where astronomy and ethics shared the same scroll. Children were raised not just in arithmetic and language, but in balance with nature, with the cosmos, with themselves. They had rituals for reflection, the priest said. Days where the city fell silent and every citizen meditated, not out of religious fear, but to maintain equilibrium. They understood the danger of noise, of too much motion. They revered stillness. Solon considered that in silence. And what changed? The priest's expression grew heavy. They grew afraid of stillness, afraid that silence meant weakness. That humility was a flaw. Solon nodded slowly. That sounds familiar. The priest chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. They stopped listening to the stars and began only listening to themselves. A wind whispered in from the corridor beyond, and for a moment the lamp's flame trembled. Shadows on the wall seemed to bend toward the scrolls, as if hungry for remembrance. And when the balance tipped, the priest said quietly, it did not tip gently. The temple grew quieter still, as if even the ancient stones were holding their breath. Outside, twilight had fully arrived. The soft buzz of cicadas had taken over the air, and far off, the call of a lone water bird echoed from the Nile's edge. But within the Temple of Sighs, only the rustle of parchment and the slow, rhythmic voice of the priest could be heard. Solon sat forward again, his fingers laced, the scroll resting across his lap. You said they stopped listening to the stars. What did they listen to instead? The priest's gaze flicked toward the ceiling, as though replaying memories that were not his own, but handed down like sacred heirlooms. Themselves, he repeated, and only themselves. Their pride grew in proportion to their abundance. He moved his hand across the diagram of the ringed city. In the beginning, they gave thanks for every harvest, celebrated the solstices with gratitude. They studied not just the stars, but the winds, the tides, the dreams of their children. But slowly, praise became performance. Reflection became display. They began building not for balance, but for glory. Solon narrowed his eyes. Did they grow cruel? In subtle ways first, said the priest. They softened, then hardened. Laws were adjusted, exceptions made. The 10 kings once bound by sacred oaths began to rule more individually. Their gatherings became more spectacle than substance. And soon the lesser kings began to envy Atlas, not for his wisdom, but his control. A quiet passed between them. You must understand, the priest continued, Atlantis did not fall in a single day. Its unraveling began in the hearts of its rulers, long before the sea claimed its stones. He stood slowly and motioned for Solon to walk with him again. They moved through a narrower corridor now, flanked by pillars shaped like bound papyrus reeds. Faintly luminescent murals lined the walls, glowing softly under the touch of lamplight. One showed a shining city crowned in gold. Another showed a ship with sails billowing outward, carved to almost seem in motion. And then a wall depicting fire raining from above, and a great wave curling over domed towers. Here, the priest said, pausing, is where we mark the turning. Solon traced a finger along the wave. Was it punishment? The priest hesitated, then said, it was consequence. He pointed to the wall's upper left corner, where the 10 kings stood in council beneath a starburst. There came a moment, remembered in our oldest texts, when the high priest of Atlantis warned them. He had studied the stars and seen signs. Not omens patterns, cycles of fire and flood, but they laughed, called him a dreamer, a relic. Solon nodded slowly. We do the same to our prophets. The priest smiled faintly. All civilizations do, until their temples are underwater. A soft breeze moved through the hall again, carrying the scent of lotus and old parchment. They began to wage wars, the priest said. First, small ones against neighboring islands, then further afield. They wanted tribute, labor, gold. They saw themselves not as stewards of balance, but as masters of the world. Solon looked troubled. And no one stopped them? The priest raised an eyebrow. Oh, someone did. They reached a mural Solon hadn't noticed before. It depicted warriors in round shields, standing in formation. They wore crested helmets and fought not with raw brutality, but elegant precision. In the background, temples, olive trees, hills shaped much like the ones outside Athens. Athens? Solon asked, awestruck. The priest nodded. Not the Athens you know, but the one before. Solon blinked. There was an earlier Athens? The priest gave a soft laugh. A much older one, stronger, in ways that would make your generals weep. A city that held to principles even when death marched at its gates. He gestured toward the mural. When Atlantis began to conquer, their gaze turned east, toward the Mediterranean, toward a land they believed would fall like the others. But the Athenians rose to meet them, not with more ships, not with gold, but with unity, with wisdom, and a refusal to be ruled. Solon stared. Why don't we remember this? The priest replied without bitterness. Because your Athens fell too, not in shame, in sacrifice. They stood against Atlantis and won, but the cost was great. Soon after, the earth shuddered and fire rained down. What remained was buried, by sea, by time, and by your own forgetting. The Athenian's mind swam. He had expected tales of kings and floods. He had not expected Athens to play the role of quiet hero in a story lost to everyone but the desert stones. The irony, the priest added, is that both cities fell within weeks of each other. Atlantis drowned in arrogance. Athens burned in loyalty. He turned back toward the temple's main chamber. Your people remember only shadows now. Myths, a few phrases. The lost city, the warrior queen. But we remember the whole. Solon looked up. Then tell me everything. Don't stop until it's all laid bare. The priest placed a hand gently on his shoulder. I intend to, but you must carry it carefully, Solon. You are not just hearing a story, you are inheriting memory. And memory, like flame, must be passed gently, or it will burn. Solon nodded, the images still swirling behind his eyes. The ringed city, the stars ignored, the warriors of Athens forgotten. He thought of the children back home who played with wooden swords, who pretended to be Achilles or Heracles. He thought of the poets, the scholars, the ones who had mocked this tale as fantasy. But he also thought of the silence in the temple, the cool weight of the scrolls in his arms, the eyes of the priest unblinking, ancient, still sharp with knowing. And he understood, deep in his bones, that something terrible and beautiful had been lost. But now, just maybe, something could be regained. Solon awoke before dawn the next day, the memory of the temple's hush still clinging to his mind like morning mist. The desert air was cool and carried the scent of distant river reeds, but his thoughts were warm with the tale's promise. He met the priest in the courtyard, where a pale moon still lingered among early stars. No words were spoken. Neither needed to speak to continue. They entered the chamber, scrolls unfurled once more, and the priest's voice, soft as the coo of temple doves, resumed the narrative. The heart of Atlantis' power lay in its blood, he began. For the sons of Poseidon were not merely heirs by divine favor, they were divine in purpose. Solon's brow furrowed. You mean the kings themselves were gods? Not immortals, the priest clarified, but embodiments of a covenant between earth and sea. The very stones of their palaces were consecrated with water drawn from springs, beneath the ocean floor water blessed by Poseidon himself. A small smile flickered on Solon's lips. Sounds like poetic flourish. The priest's eyes gleamed. In Atlantis, poetry and power were inseparable. Each king, upon his coronation, bathed in sacred water and wore a diadem carved with his personal totem line, falcon or serpent. Those totems were not mere adornments, but symbols of their duties. Lion for courage, falcon for insight, serpent for renewal. He tapped the scroll where stylized animals encircled tiny human figures. The 10 brothers each ruled a province in perfect synchrony. Their domains spread outward from the central island in rings, like ripples from a thrown stone. Canals linked these rings, carrying fresh water, trade goods, and messages. Bridges arched above the waters, their spans curled like the neck of a swan, elegant and precise. Solon pictured it all, a palace ring glowing in the sun, courtyards filled with fountains, gardens hung with fruit trees, heavy as laughter. He could almost taste the sweet apricot air of spring in Atlantis. The sons of Poseidon governed with lifelong councils. The priest went on, but each king also had a personal assembly of elders, scholars, architects, and poets. These assemblies debated every law aloud in open plazas, where citizens listened from terraced seats, like at a theater. Solon sighed. Such transparency, rare indeed. In those days, the priest said, it was expected. Justice was their highest virtue. No plea could be made behind closed doors. No bribe accepted in the dark. Even the youngest child could challenge a ruling in the court of reflection, a marble pool where judges sat listening to the echo of water, believing it carried truth. Solon chuckled softly. I could imagine my own counsel back home fainting at that. The priest let him smile. Yet for a time, it worked. Peace rippled through their empire, like the gentle swell of a quiet sea. Their merchants traveled to distant lands with banners of gleaming blue and gold. Their scholars mapped stars unknown to Egypt and Athens alike. Their architects carved vaulted chambers that sang when wind passed through. He traced a finger over the scroll's margin, where tiny constellations adorned the edge. But we mustn't mistake order for perfection. Even Poseidon's sons, born of water's calm, knew storms. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and Solon shivered despite the chamber's warmth. After centuries of harmony, seeds of discord were sown, not by enemies, but by pride. Remember that lion totem? It became a trophy. The serpent, a secret. The falcon, a spy. Solon's smile faded. They betrayed each other. In choices small and large, the priest confirmed. When the central court proposed a law capping wealth in the outer provinces, The kings of those rings whispered in shadowed halls. They argued for autonomy, for liberty. Little by little, the balance faltered. He stooped to retrieve an adjacent scroll, thinner, its edges crumbly. This also records the bloom of Atlantis's gardens, orchards of pomegranates and mandrakes, groves of palm and date. They engineered soil so fertile it grew fruit in patterns, creating edible mosaics. These gardens were open to all citizens' daily feasts held under trellised vines. Solon closed his eyes. A utopia. For a season, the priest said, but paradise, when acquired, breeds entitlement. The people began to expect miracles daily. When harvests waned after a drought, they demanded explanations. When the canals silted, they accused the central government of negligence. Their faith in gods once unshakable cracked under the weight of promises. Solon felt a pang of sympathy. So the sons of Poseidon lost the trust of their own people. Worse, the priest said, they began to lose trust in each other. And as unity frayed, so did their defenses. He stood and walked toward a window where the first light of dawn seeped through carved lattice. The empire's wealth had attracted attention. Pirates to the west, rival states to the east, but no enemy struck when they were strong. The real blow came from within. A conspiracy led by one of the 10 a surprise strike on the central island, hoping to seize the throne of Atlas and remake Atlantis in his image. Solon inhaled sharply. Civil war. For a brief but fierce season, the priest said. Bridges burned. Canals were dammed. The rope pulleys that drew water into the grand fountains snapped under sabotage. The palace's crystal columns shattered, and the people, those who once saw the kings as gods, fled in panic. The priest turned. His face was grave. They called it the War of 10 Suns, because every king bore a sun emblem on his standard. And for 10 suns, Atlantis raged against itself. Solon swallowed. What ended it? A reckoning not of man's making, the priest said softly. For when the empire lay broken, the earth itself responded. The third sun no, the third comet white-hot and trailing fire, struck the northern coast. Mountains that had stood since the world's youth cracked. Tides surged through every canal like a flood unleashed. The canals became rivers of flame and water. He closed his eyes briefly, and when the dust settled, Atlantis was gone. Not a single ring remained above the waves. Solon's heart thudded. 10 kings, brothers, torn apart by envy and undone by forces greater than pride. The priest nodded. And that, Solon, is the measure of all empires. The reach of your ambition is only as wide as your humility runs deep. A sunbeam slid across the chamber floor, illuminating the scrolls. Solon reached out and brushed his hand over the diagrams, elegant lines, faded ink, echoes of a world now silent. He thought of Athens, young and brash in its olive groves. He thought of Egypt, ancient and watchful along the Nile. And he realized that the same currents of pride and balance ran through every civilization like veins, carrying both promise and poison. Solon closed his eyes and whispered, May we be wiser for it. The priest looked at him, eyes echoing the moonlight. That, my friend, he said, is why memory matters. In the hush that followed the War of 10 Suns, Atlantis lay silent beneath the waves, its concentric rings reduced to coral-laced whisperings on the ocean floor. Yet even in ruin, the city's splendor glimmered. The priest paused, his gaze drifting as though he could see the sunken streets. He tapped one knobby finger on the stone floor, and Solon leaned in, as if memory might rise from the cracks. The true treasures of Atlantis, the priest began, were not in silver or gold, but in metals unlike any the world knows. He reached for the scroll and unrolled a fresh section, revealing swirls of coppery red and onyx black inks that seemed to dance in the lamplight. Orichalcum, he said, voice soft, gleamed brighter than bronze and rang like crystal when struck. Solon let out a low whistle. More precious than treasure, Indeed, the priest replied. Their walls were faceted with alternating bands of deep red stone and black basalt. When the sun shone, the city looked aflame from afar, as if Atlantis itself had borrowed fire from the sky. He traced a finger over the sketch, a sunburst pattern radiating from the inner temple. Imagine a parade of elephants marching behind the king's chariots, their tusks sheathed in carved ivory and orichalcum filigree. That was their procession on the Feast of Harmony. Solon chuckled softly. An elephant parade, quite the contrast to our little donkey cart. The priest allowed a tiny smile. Greeks are clever with olives. Atlanteans were clever with beasts. He tapped the image of an elephant's legs, thick as pillars. They lived in vast herds in the forests of the outer rings. Gentle giants, taught to ferry great blocks of stone, to carry water in silver tanks, to even plow the salt-tinged fields with careful steps so as not to crush delicate crops. Solon pictured it, towering elephants with calm eyes, walking beside farmers. They must have been tamed carefully. Tamed by respect, the priest explained, not by chains. Their Mahout's elephant keepers were scholars of behavior. They understood the creatures as companions, not beasts of burden. This mutual respect echoed their philosophy, power tempered by wisdom. He rolled the scroll to another Vineyard ships laden with gleaming ingots. And their minds, the priest continued, ran deeper than ours. Beneath the hills, rivers of molten metal flowed into vats, cooled into ingots and sheets. They extracted rare silver that shone like moonlight, and iron so pure it cut through steel. Traders came from Afro-Arabian kingdoms, and even the Indus Valley, carrying spices and silks in exchange. Solon leaned closer. So their wealth was global. Global and sustainable, the priest said. Their artisans forged bronze tools that lasted lifetimes. Their smiths used techniques now lost to us. They'd quench metal in salted water drawn from deep springs to give it strength and flexibility. We found remnants of these tools even centuries after the fall-tipped arrowheads, chisels, and surgical knives, so sharp they glided through cloth like whispers. He closed his eyes briefly. In our vaults, we have a blade inscribed with the name of a king of Atlantis Canton, son of Atlas. It's so finely balanced, a child can lift it with one finger. Solon raised an eyebrow. A royal toy. More a symbol, the priest corrected. The blade represented the king's duty, to be precise in judgment and gentle in use. It served in ceremonies as often as in defense. When our priests first held it, we marveled not at its sharpness, but at its artistry, the way it reflected light, how its hilt fit a hand as if born to it. He unrolled another scroll, this one mapping vast underwater terraces. And below the waves, he said, the stones still sing. He waved his hand across the illustration. Concentric platforms descending into blue twilight. Coral has claimed the broken walls, and fish weave between archways like living tapestries. But if you know where to look, where the currents shift, you can see the glint of orichalcum, the dark veins of basalt, and the red granite that once lined royal halls. Solon closed his eyes. I can almost hear the hum of those halls. The priest nodded. Some divers in later ages Phoenicians, Romans told tales of diving bells made of leather and copper, of treasure hunters who glimpsed jewels in broken statues. Few returned, and even fewer spoke truth. Those who did warned of traps-flooded chambers that sealed with sudden tides, corridors that collapsed. Atlantis's underworld was as well defended as its palaces. A playful light touched the priest's eyes. I've heard one story, likely exaggerated, of a priest who rigged stone doors to fall on any intruder. The diver escaped by tickling giant clams, which clamped shut on the stones and held them long enough for him to swim out. Solon laughed, the sound echoing in the chamber. Tickling clams now, that's diplomacy. The priest chuckled too, then grew serious. But beneath all the legends lies a truth Atlantis's riches were part of its essence. They were never hoarded. The wealth circulated. Artisans, farmers, scholars each received support. Libraries were stocked with papyrus and bronze tablets. Gardens ran on hydraulic pumps strong enough to lift water from spring to terrace, and poets recited tributes in the grand amphitheater, their voices carried by acoustic designs so perfect you could hear a whisper from 100 meters away. He paused, letting the wonder settle. They believed white marble spoke best of purity, red granite of strength, and black basalt of permanence. So they built in tricolor harmony. Every building was a statement, balance in color, in form, in material. Solon swallowed. It was art as architecture. Art as life, the priest agreed. They saw no division. Their cities were galleries, and their lives were exhibitions. Every street, every fountain, every carved pillar was a verse in a poem of stone. He rolled up the scrolls slowly, reverently. So when the waters claimed Atlantis, they claimed more than gold. They claimed a vision of human possibility. And yet, even now, the echoes remain if we choose to listen. Solon reached out, brushing his fingertips over the scripts one last time before standing. Then perhaps a piece of that vision can return. The priest placed a hand on Solon's arm. Only if you spread the memory, stone by stone, story by story. Only then can the riches beneath the waves become riches of the mind. Outside, the first rays of sunlight struck the temple steps, and Solon felt the weight of history in his chest heavy, yes, but enlivening too, like breathing through a new dawn. He bowed his head. I will remember. The morning sun spilled over the desert walls, gilding the temple courtyard where Solon and the priest met once more. Solon carried a jug of fresh water, still cool from the Nile's flow, and offered it to the priest. The old man accepted with a nod, his eyes already distant, as though he could see the battlefield of memory laid out before him. You've seen their grandeur, the priest said softly, tracing his finger over the smooth lip of the water jug. Now you must learn of their courage. Solon steadied himself. The war with Athens. The priest's gaze sharpened. Yes, a clash that became legend here long before your bards sang of Troy. He settled onto the stone bench, gesturing for Solon to sit beside him. The air carried a faint hint of lotus pollen, mingling with the scent of inked scrolls. Solon inhaled, ready for the tale. In the age when Atlantis ruled the Western Sea, it cast its shadow across islands and coasts. Tribute came from many lands, willingly at first, then by force. But when the Atlantean gaze fell upon the land of the Athenians, they saw something unexpected. The priest paused, as though listening for unheard footsteps. Not wealth, he continued, not grand armies, but a city small and modest, framed by olive groves, whose people valued wisdom more than gold. Solon smiled wryly. That sounds like Athens even now. The priest's lips quirked. Your people have changed little. Even then, they prized debate over conquest. He unrolled a fresh scroll, revealing a map of the eastern Mediterranean. Clusters of islands, winding coastlines, and a tiny marking for Athens almost lost among larger symbols for Tyre, Carthage, and Sicily. Look, the priest pointed. No one expected Athens to stand. Yet when Atlantis sent heralds demanding tribute gold, grain, and loyalty, the Athenians did something unheard of. Solon leaned closer. They refused? Exactly. Refused, the priest said, letting the word hang. They sent back a single barrel of finest olive oil and a potter's jar. Inside each, a small token. One unbroken olive branch, one empty vase. Messages that spoke of self-reliance and peace, but also of unyielding spirit. Solon chuckled softly. An olive branch and an empty vase poetic, but risky. Riskier still, the priest agreed. For when the Atlantean heralds saw the jars, they laughed. They smashed the vases in disdain, spilled the oil in contempt, and told Athens they would return with ships of war if tribute was not forthcoming. Solon's face hardened. and the Athenians prepared to fight. The priest nodded, his ancient eyes glowing. They did. They knew their walls were small, their ships few, but they had something Atlantis lacked: unity, born of necessity. He described how the Athenians summoned every citizen, from weavers to philosophers, to gather at the Acropolis. There, beneath the watchful marble gaze of Athena's statue, they swore an oath, to defend their home or die trying. Solon's heart pounded. A vow in front of the goddess. A vow under stone and sky, the priest corrected. And when the Atlantean armada of 500 ships in total rounded the southern cape, they found Athens ready. He painted the scene. Dawn's light shimmering on bronze shields, archers lining the walls, catapults perched on towers. Children stood beside their fathers, nets at the ready, eyes wide with resolve. The Atlanteans came in 3 waves, the priest said, each fleet larger than the last. They expected easy victory. But the Greeks had studied the currents and winds knowledge gleaned not from stone, but from lived experience. Solon cocked an eyebrow. Your people know currents well. We do, the priest admitted, but the Athenians knew the coast's quirks. They anchored their smaller triremes behind hidden shoals, forcing the larger Atlantean vessels to break formation or risk running aground. He leaned forward. When the first fleet hit the shoals, they broke apart like frayed ropes. Their bronze prows twisted on submerged rocks. The Athenians seized the moment swift ships darting between enemy hulks, severing mooring lines, burning sails. Solon's lips twitched, a bit like swatting flies with spears. The priest allowed a hint of amusement. Apt analogy. The second wave fared worse. The Athenians launched flaming arrows that set many decks ablaze, turning proud vessels into drifting infernos. Solon shivered despite the warm temple air. That must have been terrifying, but not as terrifying as the final wave, the priest said. He paused, his voice dropping. The 10 kings of Atlantis led it personally. They sailed on the flagship Thalassarch, a vessel of ivory and orichalcum, its sails catching the wind like a great golden shell. Solon swallowed. They came to crush Athens themselves. They did, the priest confirmed. And at sea, their tactics were ruthlessly effective. They rammed Athenian ships, cast nets that pulled oars from rowers' hands, unleashed marines trained in the use of tridents and spears. The priest's tone turned somber. Athens nearly fell that day. Their walls shook under the bombardment, their docks burned, their people cried out in fear. But the Athenians had one final gambit. Solon leaned in. What was it? An ambush, the priest said. They lured the Atlantean flagship into a narrow inlet too tight for maneuvering. The Athenians had prepared. Hidden in coves were triremes with reinforced prows. At the signal a trumpet's blast, they surged out, ramming the flagship's sides. Solon's eyes widened. A direct attack on the king's ship. Yes, the Thalassarch listed. Its huge sails fell limp. The 10 kings found themselves stranded, their vessels unable to turn. And there, amid the wreckage, the Athenians boarded. He painted the image, the bronze collars of Atlantean armor clashing, the glint of spears, the hiss of seawater mixing with blood. Yet the priest added gently, the Athenians did not slaughter them. It was not Sparta. Instead, they captured the kings and brought them before the goddess's statue. Solon's breath caught. Alive? Alive, the priest said, though wounded. The Athenians offered mercy. They bound the kings to the altar's base and pointed swords at their throats. He leaned closer, voice hushed. Then, in the hush that followed, an Athenian elder stepped forward. With tears in his eyes, he spoke not of hate, but of hope. He said, "We spare you, not because you are weak, but because we know fear. May this mercy teach humility." Solon exhaled slowly. A remarkable act. It was, the priest agreed, and it changed the course of history. The kings, humbled, swore oaths of peace. The Athenians released them, sending them home with gifts of olive oil and grapes, the same tokens the Atlanteans once scorned. Solon smiled. Full circle. Indeed, the priest said. And though the war eased, the memory remained. In Egypt, we recorded it as the day of the olive and the vase, a testament that even the mightiest empire can be brought low by the simplest virtues. Solon looked at the scroll, at the tiny olive branch drawn beside an empty vase. Simple virtues, he murmured. Courage, mercy, unity. The priest patted his shoulder. Remember this, Solon, for in the end, it was not orichalcum or elephants, or golden laws that saved a people. It was their ability to listen, to be brave, and to show compassion. A gentle breeze drifted through the chamber, lifting stray grains of dust like golden motes. Solon closed his eyes, letting the lesson settle deep within him. And as the priest rolled up the scrolls, Solon knew that no matter what lay ahead in the tale, no matter the cataclysms or the ruins, the spirit of that small city by the sea would burn forever in human memory. The courtyard lamps flickered as the priest rolled out the next scroll, its parchment worn at the edges, but alive with images. Solon leaned forward, anticipation coiling in his chest. He had seen Atlantis's glory, witnessed its wisdom, felt the tension in its fall. But now he would hear of its final hour. The downfall of Atlantis was neither swift nor simple. The priest began, voice low and rhythmic, but an unfolding of judgments, first by man, then by nature, and finally by the gods. Solon's pulse quickened. Tell me. The scroll's central panel depicted a dark sky riven by red light. Below it, waves surged like beasts, and people ran in terror. It began with omens, the priest explained. Strange tremors shook the ground. In the outer rings, fountains ran dry one morning. In the inner, fish washed ashore, gills flaring in the sun. Scholars argued over causes, but the kings proud in their orichalcum halls dismissed the warnings as petty disturbances. Solon frowned. A familiar error. The priest nodded. Indeed. And then the sky erupted. A second sun-ablazing comet tore the night open. It passed close enough. The Atlanteans swore they heard it roar. Hot embers rained upon their golden rooftops, setting temples, homes, and granaries ablaze. Solon gasped. A firestorm? Worse, the priest said. A conflagration that spread faster than water could douse. Granite walls exploded under heat. Wooden beams cracked and fell. Citizens fled into canals to escape the flames, only to find their waterways collapsing from underground quakes. He pointed to a smaller vignette. People clinging to each other, drifting amid debris. Then the earth groaned. Great fissures opened in the ringed avenues. Bridges toppled. Chambers where families once feasted became chasms of smoke and ruin. Solon's voice caught. They were trapped. Some, the priest conceded. Others fled east, hoping the winds would carry ash away. But the comet's passage weakened the pillars beneath the ocean floor. The sea, which had long listened patiently, surged in. Walls that held water back cracked. Canals became rivers of destruction. And in a single night, the outer rings were swallowed. He paused, letting the horror sink in. A hush fell, as though the temple itself mourned. But the heart of Atlantis, its central island, resisted. The 10 kings gathered amid collapsing columns, their faces lit by flickering fires and the comet's dying glow. They prayed at the temple of Poseidon, hoping for mercy. Solon's throat tightened. Did the god answer? The priest's gaze drifted upward. He answered with the sea. A colossal wave taller than the highest tower rolled in under the fractured moonlight. It crushed the court where the kings knelt, washing away thrones, scrolls, and statues. The wave retreated, then thundered back and again, until the island was little more than flotsam in a churning sea. Solon exhaled, picturing the devastation. And after that? Silence, the priest said softly. A stillness so deep, even dolphins exploring the ruins paused. The rings vanished beneath coral and silt. The fires smoldered out. The comet's ember died. And Atlantis was no more. Solon closed his eyes. The weight of loss pressed in on him. But memory, the priest continued, is stubborn. It clings in whispers. He showed a small etching at the scroll's margin. A lone survivor drifting in a makeshift raft. A priestess, daughter of one king, escaped on a carved wooden vessel. She carried a single scroll and the pendant of Poseidon, an olive branch encased in crystal. Solon's breath caught. She survived. In the only way she could, by honoring the balance. The priest's voice softened. She sailed south to the Nile, where she found refuge among Egyptian seers. There, she taught our people the last rites of Atlantis. Songs of rainfall, rituals of renewal, and the names of the 10 kings. Solon nodded, eyes moist. So Egypt kept the flame alive. Not brightly, the priest admitted, but enough. Enough that 9,000 years later, a Greek might sit here and hear the tale. He rolled up the scroll, reverent. The end of Atlantis was the beginning of a cautionary tale. A reminder that even greatness can drown in its own fire. Solon lifted his head. The temple lamps had guttered low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. What of the survivors? He asked. Did any others escape? The priest reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small shard of pottery, a broken fragment with a spiral symbol. Fishermen off Crete found this, and a few fishermen off Sicily found more. A scattered handful remembered a city of rings, a god-king's daughter, and a story they told around hearth fires until their voices were cold. He placed the shard in Solon's palm. It was smooth, worn by water, but the spiral still faintly glowed in the torchlight. Hold this, the priest said, and remember that history is not what happens to us. It is what we choose to carry. Atlantis is ash and coral now, but its lessons are as living as your pulse. Solon closed his hand over the shard, feeling its promise. I will carry it. The priest smiled, old and tender. Good, and now you know the end. But remember, endings live only in silence. Speak the tale. Let it breathe in new tongues. Solon exhaled, rising slowly. I vow to tell it. As he stepped back into the moonlit courtyard, the priest's final words followed him like the echo of a song. In every age, Atlantis rises again in every heart that seeks balance over hubris. And under the same moon that once watched Atlantis burn, Solon felt a spark of resolve ignite within him bright enough to outlast any comet's fire. The chill of early night clung to Solon's skin as he walked the temple courtyard, the shard of pottery heavy with memory in his palm. He paused beneath the statue of Neith, goddess of weaving and war, and felt the old priest's footsteps behind him, soft but certain, like a heartbeat in the hush. You wonder, the priest said, voice low as shadow, what became of those few who escaped? Solon turned, eyes reflecting torchlight. Yes, you spoke of fishermen in Crete and Sicily, but did any form new lives? Pass on more than fragments? The priest nodded slowly. Some survivors found refuge along distant coasts. They integrated with other peoples, weaving their customs into new tapestries of culture. Yet they always carried the weight of being children of the drowned city. He led Solon toward a raised platform where the temple's sacred fire was kept. The flame danced in a bronze brazier, casting gold patterns on the stone underfoot. Look, the priest said, pointing to a tiny brass bowl beside the brazier. This bowl once held salt water from Atlantis's inner canal water, blessed by Poseidon on the night of the comet's fall. Solon knelt, peering at the bowl. A few droplets still clung to its rim, crystallized. Real water, he breathed. The priest dipped a finger into the remaining salt slick and touched Solon's lips. A taste of memory, he said. Keep that. Solon rose, holding the bowl carefully. The priest continued. In Crete, an Aegean fisherwoman named Philea recovered the pendant of the priestess. She did not know its power, but she wore it around her neck. By her hearth, she told stories of a city of rings, of orichalcum temples, and of kings who spoke with dolphins. The priest smiled as though watching her speak. Her neighbors called her mad, until her words shaped their own myths of 7 cities in the sea. Solon closed his eyes. So Atlantis lived on as legend. Exactly, the priest said. In time, the fragments formed poems. In time, the poems formed legends. In time, the legends became myth stories told to children to keep them from drowning in pride. He led Solon away from the brazier, past a line of silent statues. In Sicily, a group of refugees settled in an inland valley. They planted olive groves on terraces shaped like Atlantis's rings. Solon imagined it, rolling hills of trees in concentric patterns, a living echo of the drowned city. They harvested olives twice a year, teaching the locals to press oil with hand-carved presses their ancestors had brought from Atlantis. And at harvest, they raised jars high, reciting words in a strange tongue, reminding each other of home. Solon listened, picturing voices lost and found. You ask if they form new lives, the priest said, and they did, but their customs clung to them. At weddings, brides wore ivory combs etched with spiral symbols. At funerals, mourners dropped small tokens of basalt into rivers, believing each would carry a soul toward rebirth. Solon raised an eyebrow. These rituals survived alongside local gods? The priest nodded. They adapted. The spiral became a symbol of the underworld. The combs became amulets. But the heart of the ritual, the belief in cycles, in balance, in returning, remained. They moved toward a row of alcoves, each holding a small niche painted with scenes. A woman planting trees, a man carving metal, children dancing. These, the priest said, are the alcoves where Egyptians first recorded the refugees' tales. Not as histories, but as moral lessons. Beware hubris, honor nature, treasure memory. Solon touched one niche, tracing the faded paint. So Egypt became a guardian of their story. In part, the priest agreed. But Egypt also transformed the story. We wove it into our own tapestry. The spiral motif appears in temple pylons. The saltwater ritual echoes in our rites of purification. Yet we never claimed Atlantis as ours. We claimed only its wisdom. He walked back to Solon and placed a hand on his arm. And now, Solon, you carry not only scrolls, but living memory. Solon felt the priest's gaze as a gentle weight. What must I do? Share, the priest said simply. Not as conquest, but as gift. Plant olives of knowledge. Invite others to taste the salt water of remembrance. Teach the balance of heart, mind, and soul. Solon nodded, feeling the bowl's cool metal against his chest. I will. The priest smiled, then motioned toward the temple's exit. Come, there is one more thing. They stepped outside into the velvet night. The stars above seemed sharper here, unblinded by city fires. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a pale river, and Solon thought he could almost see the spiral of Atlantis in its gleaming arms. In Athens, the priest said, in your homeland, there is a Senate hall by the sea. It is built on ancient stones, older than any of your temples. The foundation stones were quarried from a coast long forgotten. He pointed toward the dark horizon. I want you to find those stones. Touch them. Speak the names of the kings. Remind your people that the ground beneath their feet has its own story. Solon exhaled. A pilgrimage. A rite of passage, the priest agreed. It will be dangerous violent storms, treacherous currents, and those who scoff at the fanciful tale of a sunken empire. But the journey will root you in truth. Solon reached into his tunic and produced a small clay token, a carving of the lotus and the Ouroboros entwined. I took this from the vault. The priest's eyes softened. Keep it safe. It is your compass. They stood together in silence, the night heavy with possibility. At last, Solon said, I will go. The priest placed his hand on Solon's shoulder. Go with balance in your heart, and when you return, you will complete the memory. Solon bowed his head, the first motion of a vow. The distant Nile rippled under moonlight, and the night's breeze whispered promises of voyage and revelation. As Solon turned to face the path home, he felt the weight of Atlantis settle around him, not as a burden, but as a cloak of purpose woven from ancient threads. And in that moment, he understood that survival wasn't just escaping ruin, but carrying its lessons forward, like water in a sacred bowl, fresh and brimming with meaning. Solon left the temple before first light, the priest's final words echoing in his ears like distant temple bells. Remind your people that the ground beneath their feet has its own story. With the saltwater bowl secured inside a cloth pouch and the spiral token worn against his chest, he set off through the streets of Sais, quiet and steeped in dew. But his journey was far from over. Guided by trade routes and starlight, Solon traveled northeast, his mind still wrapped in the rings of Atlantis, its geometry, its gold, its glory and grief. He passed through towns that pulsed with market life, villages where children played beside goats in broken columns, and ports where ships creaked against weathered docks. All the while, he asked quiet questions to fishermen, traders, and storytellers. What do you know of a city that sank? Most shrugged. A few whispered, You mean the western island, with silver roads? One old sailor touched his ear and muttered, They say you hear bells in the waves when the wind blows right, but only madmen dive for them. Solon listened, always listened, and slowly the threads began to twine together. In a village near the Levantine coast, an old woman brewed bitter tea beside a cracked amphora. My grandmother spoke of kings with golden hair who wept at the sea, she said, and of priests who buried their names in honey jars. Honey jars? Solon asked. She winked. To sweeten the memory. Solon smiled and left that night with a small jar of his own. As he neared the Aegean, his thoughts turned homeward. Athens, still in its adolescent swagger, would be skeptical of his tale. But he carried more than scrolls. He carried symbols. He had the shard, the pendant, the salt. The story had ripened within him. He was no longer just a listener. He was a keeper. Arriving in Athens, Solon found the city unchanged in shape, but newly altered in his eyes. The Acropolis shimmered in the early evening sun, and children ran in the shadow of the Parthenon skeleton. At the port, familiar voices called out from ships' names, jokes, haggling. He made his way to the Senate Hall by the sea, the one the priest had spoken of, its foundation stones worn smooth by centuries of sea spray and barefooted philosophers. Solon knelt and touched the base-cool, firm humming. He whispered the names of the 10 kings, his voice soft but steady. Atlas, Idyrus, Amphiers, Evaemon, Mnesius, Autochthon, Elasippus, Mestor, Azaz, Diaprepes. He felt something, not a quake, not a voice, but a presence like recognition, like the stone nodding in silence. Solon rose and walked into the chamber where his peers were gathered, debating trade routes and grain supplies. They barely noticed him at first, so he waited, watching the light creep across the marble floor. Then he stepped forward and placed the Atlantean shard on the central table. It glittered. I have been to Egypt, he began, and returned with more than stories. I bring you a warning, a lesson, and a memory. Skeptical glances. A few indulgent smiles. A tale, Solon? Another one of your poetic lectures? One senator teased. But Solon's voice didn't waver. This tale is old. Older than Athens. It is the story of a city built in harmony, ruled by justice, lost to pride. A city with rings of land and sea, elephants that mourned their keepers, and temples where the stones sang. More senators looked up now. A hush grew. He told them of the comet, of the wave, of the king's oath before the goddess, of Athens' victory, of the pendant in his hand, of the priest in Sais who whispered the names. And as he spoke, something changed in the room. The senators leaned forward, not scoffing now, but transfixed. This wasn't a fantasy. It was memory, returning like tide to shore. When he finished, no one clapped. No one moved. Finally, an old councilman stood. "If even part of what you say is true," he said, "then it is not just a tale, it is a mirror. We must look into it." Solon nodded. "We must." At evening, by lantern light, the council voted to commission a formal record of the Atlantis tale to be etched onto bronze, plates and stored in the great library. Solon supervised the work himself. He carefully translated every symbol, every phrase, not just from the Egyptian scrolls, but from memory, his memories. He walked barefoot across the stones of the old Senate Hall each morning, whispering the king's names again, until they felt less foreign and more ancestral. The bronze plates were finally completed in the spring, polished and hung on a wall near the city archives. Visitors came and stared, most for only a few moments. But children lingered, tracing the rings with curious fingers. One boy asked, "Why did Atlantis fall?" Solon knelt beside him. "Because they forgot to listen." To who? To themselves. To the sea. To each other. The boy frowned. "That's not so hard," Solon smiled. "Then maybe we'll be all right." At night, in his private chambers, Solon still held the spiral token. Sometimes he dreamed of the temple in Sais, of the priest's voice, of the rings shining like halos in the sunlight. He wrote poems he didn't share, verses shaped like ripples, rhymes soft as tide foam. And once a month, he visited the seashore and poured a pinch of salt water into the waves. "Not for grief," he'd whisper, "for gratitude." The story had found a new harbor, and though Atlantis slept beneath the sea, its memory drifted like kelp in the currents, reaching new shores, new dreamers, new builders of balance. The midday sun cast a serene glow over Athens as Solon stepped onto the marble steps of the great library. Its columns, tall and white, seemed to shimmer with promised knowledge. After all, thrives in light. In his satchel lay powerful relics of memory, the bowl with its last salt water, the spiral token, and a copy of the bronze plates recording Atlantis' tale. Today, he would ensure that memory lived not only in hearts, but in stone. Within the library's cool halls, rows of shelves held scroll after scroll. Scribes and scholars bent over desks, quills scratching, voices hushed. Solon's presence drew polite bows. He carried himself with quiet purpose, each step a reminder of his mission. "Here," he began, addressing a circle of attentive librarians and aristocratic patrons, "is our inheritance. Not of gold or territory, but of understanding. Atlantis was more than a city. It was a lesson in balance, in harmony between people, nature, and the divine." He laid the bronze plates on a low pedestal carved with olive branches. The plates gleamed. On each, concentric rings were etched in relief, symbols carved around their edges, lotus flowers, tridents, spirals, and stars. Below each diagram lay inscriptions in Greek, painstakingly translated from Egyptian originals. Scholars leaned in. A murmur rippled through the group. Solon watched, heart steady, as true curiosity sparked in their eyes. "Let us gather not to debate myth," Solon said, "but to explore memory. To ask, what can we learn from a city lost to pride? From kings humbled by mercy? From a people who drowned because they forgot to listen?" A young scholar raised his hand. "Master Solon, the plates say the kings governed in rotating assemblies. How did they prevent disorder when 10 voices spoke at once?" Solon smiled. "They practiced stillness. Before every council, they observed a moment of reflection, No voices, no gestures, only breath. They believed that in silence, wisdom emerges. Then, each king spoke in turn, mindful of the next. They treated each other as equals, even when their territories differed in wealth. Another patron, an elderly woman with keen eyes, asked, "And these elephants you describe, how might we study their behavior?" Solon retrieved a small, intricately carved ivory figurine from his pouch, an elephant flaring its trunk, gentle eyes in stone. "From this," he said, "we can infer their relationship with humans, one of mutual respect. Training was not punishment, but guidance. We might send envoy to study herds rumored near Crete, though they are fewer now. Perhaps learn again the art of companionship." The room buzzed with new ideas. Plans formed. Expeditions to underwater ruins, botanical gardens reflecting Atlantis' orchards, philosophical societies practicing reflective silence. Solon stood back, letting their enthusiasm bloom. His own mind drifted briefly to the temple in size, the cryptic reliefs, the guarded alcoves, the oil lamps flickering in the subterranean hall. He missed the priest's calm presence. Yet here, in Athens, new guardians of memory were rising. A scribe approached, carrying a fresh scroll. "Master Solon, a message from Sparta. They wish to incorporate the story of Atlantis into their festival of the Twin Kings." As a cautionary tale of hubris, Solon nodded thoughtfully. "Then let Sparta know. The story belongs to all who listen. Offer them the spiral token's replica. Let it remind them of cycles, of renewal." The scribe bowed and departed. Solon turned to the assembled crowd. "Our work is not to worship Atlantis," he said, voice firm, "but to learn from it. To build cities where justice follows mercy, where knowledge respects nature, where wealth flows, not stagnates." A hush fell, then applause rippled like wind through reeds. Solon allowed himself a small smile. Later, as dusk painted the sky in rose and violet, Solon climbed to the roof of the library. Alone, he raised the bowl of salt water. Beneath him, Athens glowed with lamplight and laughter. The Acropolis stood sentinel against the horizon. He dipped a finger into the bowl and flicked droplets into the breeze. "For gratitude," he whispered, "and for remembrance." Below, the city seemed to pulse with life. Solon felt a quiet joy. Memory had taken root. These citizens, skeptical but curious, would pass the tale onward. Children would learn of the ringed city. Poets would seek its rhythms. Philosophers would ponder its fall. But the true legacy, he knew, would be in their actions. Building with balance, ruling with mercy, honoring silence before speech. As stars blinked awake, Solon settled against a low parapet. He gazed east, imagining the path beyond Athens, lands still untouched by the tale. He would send copies of the bronze plates to cities across the Mediterranean, to Tyre, to Carthage, to Knossos, so that every harbor might hold a fragment of Atlantis' memory. Suddenly, a soft voice called from behind. "Master Solon?" He turned to see his daughter, a quiet child of 10 summers, clutching a small wax tablet. "I wanted to ask," she said, eyes bright, "can I learn the names of the kings too? I wrote them all down." Solon's heart warmed. He knelt, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Of course, little one. They belong to you and all who wish to remember." She beamed, and he led her through the plates, pointing to each name, Atlas, Gadeirus, Amphiers, until she recited them all without falter. Solon hugged her, whispering, "You will grow up with these names as friends." She giggled, pressing her tablet to her chest like a talisman. Above them, the stars wheeled in silent arcs, and in the cooling air, the memory of Atlantis breathed anew through bronze plates, through a child's recitation, through a city that chose to remember rather than forget. Tonight, Athens slept under a canopy of lessons learned, and Solon, heart full, closed his eyes with hope that this memory, shared freely, would ripple outward, shaping worlds yet to be built. The following weeks unfolded like the slow unfurling of a scroll each day, revealing a new line, a new ripple of impact from Solon's journey. Word of the Atlantis account traveled faster than Solon expected, whispered in symposiums, taught in schoolyards, even debated in the bustling stalls of the Agora. Some called it a legend, others a prophecy. A few, those with older eyes, called it a warning, whispered just in time. Solon walked among them often, quiet as a shadow, listening to the stories they shaped from his. He noticed how different minds seized on different threads. Merchants marveled at the trade networks of Atlantis. Architects pondered the structural ingenuity of the ringed city. And philosophers? The philosophers. They lingered over the moral core. It's not about a city, one said over a cup of honeyed wine. It's about a state of mind. Atlantis fell when its soul became too heavy with pride. Like a ship, said another, listing under too much treasure. Solon, seated nearby but unnoticed, sipped quietly and smiled. He returned often to the bronze plates in the library, sometimes with his daughter, sometimes alone. He noticed new offerings placed at their base: a carved olive branch, a child's clay dolphin, a wreath of dried lotus. People were not just reading the tale, they were feeling it. One morning, a young envoy from Knossos arrived at Solon's door. She introduced herself as Ilaria, daughter of a seafarer and priestess of Demeter. "My grandmother told me the sea once swallowed a city," she said. "When I heard your account, I recognized her phrases. The rings, the orichalcum, even the elephants." Solon invited her in. Over sweetbread and figs, she recited verses passed down in her family. They were different in tone, more lyrical, shaped by the tides of oral tradition, but unmistakably connected to the memory he carried. "I believe Atlantis left more than ruins," Ilaria said. "It left seeds, and those seeds took root wherever survivors landed." Solon's eyes lit with recognition. "Like how driftwood finds shore." "Yes," she said. "Some drifted here." Together, they began compiling the shared threads matching, her chants with Egyptian scroll fragments, weaving a cross-cultural tapestry of memory. With her help, Solon initiated the formation of the first circle of the Rememberers, a quiet fellowship of scribes, philosophers, and travelers devoted to preserving not just the tale, but the principles of Atlantis. The circle did not seek to rebuild Atlantis. That would have been folly. Rather, they studied its values, its rise through harmony, its fall through excess. They met beneath olive trees and beside coastal shrines, reciting the 10 kings' names not as rulers, but as roles: Atlas, Balance Gadiris, Justice Amphiers, Mercy Evamen, Knowledge Mesius, Reflection Autochthon, Nature Elasippus, Courage, Mestre, Wisdom Aezes, Restraint Diaprepes, Humility. Each member chose a name to guide them not as title, but as reminder. Soon, these ideas spread. Cities began hosting balance feasts where no hierarchy governed the meal. Everyone sat in concentric circles, shared food without price, and told stories of those they honored. Temples added spiral carvings beside their traditional motifs. Olive trees were planted in rings around town centers. Solon watched this blooming with cautious joy. He knew the human heart still held chaos, but these gestures meant that someone was listening. One evening, a storm broke over Athens, lightning flashing like bronze swords in the sky. Solon stood at his window, wind pressing against the shutters, and thought of Atlantis's final night. When the wind quieted, he stepped into the garden and placed the saltwater bowl under the ring. The droplets hissed as they touched the metal, as if the sky were answering the sea. Inside, his daughter was reading by lamplight. She looked up. Will Atlantis ever return? Solon sat beside her. Not as it was, he said, but in pieces, yes. In choices we make. In how we build. She tilted her head. So if I grow up and build a school where every student takes turns being teacher ... He smiled. And that is a ring of Atlantis. They both laughed. A letter arrived weeks later from Carthage. A copy of the bronze plates had arrived safely. They had been read aloud in the great square, and an old sailor claimed he had once fished near a place where the sea sang like bells. Solon closed the letter with trembling hands. Atlantis lived, not in walls or gold, but in the breath between two sentences, in the silence before a name is spoken, in the salt that stings and heals. He walked to the garden that night, to the olive sapling he and his daughter had planted months earlier. It now stood nearly as tall as her. He circled it slowly once, twice, 3 times, forming his own ring around the memory. Then he whispered, "We remember." The leaves rustled gently, and somewhere, in the unfathomable deep, beneath layers of silt and coral, the bones of a great city dreamed not of vengeance, but of being known again. As morning light filtered through the columns of the library courtyard, Solon felt the thrum of possibility in the air. The first circle of the rememberers had gathered before dawn, their whispered oaths carried by a gentle breeze scented with olive blossoms. In a ring of marble seats, philosophers, scribes, and travelers sat facing inward, each holding a small token, a spiral of clay, a carved ivory comb, a fragment of orichalcum alloy. These tokens, passed from Sais to Athens and beyond, bound them in purpose, a sacred duty to remember. Solon rose at the center of the circle, the weight of shared history humming in his chest. He lifted his spiral token high, so sunlight glinted off its ancient lines. "Friends," he began in a soft yet clear voice, "we stand in a moment between the past and the future. Atlantis' stones may lie beneath waves, but its voice lives in our choices. Today, we reaffirm our covenant, to hold memory not as burden, but as guide." A hush settled. Gently he continued, "We remember so that balance prevails. When power grows, let us recall how 10 kings, born of the sea, faltered when hubris clouded their judgment. When knowledge expands, may we reflect on the libraries that once sang with poetry and science lost, when fire rained from the sky. When joy flourishes, may we temper it with gratitude, as children of a drowned paradise once did." He paced the inner ring, every step measured. Our duty is not mere preservation, it is infusion. We weave these lessons into our laws, our schools, our temples. We plant olives in concentric groves around civic spaces. We carve spirals on doorposts to remind ourselves of cycles' endings, at birth beginnings. We hold balance feasts where no one sits above another, where every voice matters. A young scholar, clutching a bronze tablet, asked, "But Master Solon, how do we bear this duty when life presses on? When crops fail, or wars brew, or the sea brings strangers seeking refuge?" Solon met her gaze. "We bear it by remembering what sustains us. When storms rise, recall Atlantis' sacred water, salt water, offered before the goddess. We share water freely, welcoming strangers as kin. When conflict looms, recall Athens' mercy, the empty vase and olive branch, and choose unity over dominance. When scarcity bites, recall the ringed courtyards where food was shared, not hoarded." He turned to an elder of Sparta who had traveled across land. "And you, friend, whose city values strength, how shall memory temper that virtue?" The Spartan elder nodded, hand on a comb-shaped amulet. "We shall teach our youths not just to wield the spear, but to question its purpose, to honor mercy as well as might." Solon's lips curved. "Then you carry the memory well." Above them, pigeons cooed and merchants' distant chatter threaded through the columns. Solon raised his arms, the sunlight warming his skin. "Today, we rededicate ourselves to being stewards of memory. Let each of us return to our homes, our cities, our fields, with a pledge to speak of Atlantis not as myth, but as lesson. To honor its kings not as gods, but as guides whose virtues and failures chart our path. Each member of the circle rose, touching their tokens to their hearts and murmuring, "We remember." The collective sound, like wind through reeds, carried through the courtyard and into the city beyond its walls. After the ceremony, Solon walked with Ilaria along the path of olive saplings. Dew clung to leaves, and bees hovered like floating gems. "Why does remembering feel sacred?" she asked. "Why not let the past rest?" Solon paused, plucking a leaf and pinching it between thumb and forefinger. "Memory is our compass. Without it, we sail blind, believing the present eternal. We forget that empires rise and fall, that harmony can be fragile, that pride and neglect can drown us in our own success." He released the leaf. It swirled to the path. The duty to remember is not to trap us in nostalgia, but to guide our steps, to temper our actions, to keep the rings of balance intact. She nodded, thoughts weaving like threads. "Then this circle, it's more than a club. It's a living monument." "Precisely," Solon said. "We are stones without mortar until we bind ourselves to memory and to each other. Together, we make the structure strong." Over the next days, the circle published Manifesto's short papyrus scrolls distributed to cities far and wide, Crete, Carthage, Tyre, and beyond. Each scroll bore the spiral emblem and 10 concise maxims derived from the king's virtues. Traders carried them in their wares. Travelers left them in guest houses. Children learned them in schools as rhythmic chants. And then, in a moment of quiet triumph, Solon received a messenger from Sparta. The great festival of the Twin Kings would commemorate balance feasts alongside ancestral military games. Statues of the 2 Spartan monarchs would be flanked by spiral banners and olive torches. It was, the messenger wrote, a union of strength and mercy, echoing Atlantis's forgotten harmony. Solon read the letter beneath an olive grove at dusk, the leaves whispering overhead. He felt the sacred duty fulfilled not perfectly, but living. He clasped the spiral token and whispered, "They remember." That night, as he walked home, Solon considered how memory, once a fragile scroll, had become a living force, shaping laws, ceremonies, and daily rituals. He thought of the priests of Sais guarding their stone archives, of the refugees in Crete whispering tales beside hearth fires, of children in Athens reciting the king's names like ancient lullabies. Memory had been shared, sacredly tended, and in doing so, had become woven into the tapestry of human experience. Under a sky bright with stars, Solon realized that Atlantis was no longer a distant realm beneath the sea. It was here in every olive ring, every spiral carving, every act of mercy. The city may have vanished, but its echo lived on in hearts determined to remember. He closed his eyes, breathing deep, and felt the pulse of history in his veins, a promise that as long as memory remained sacred, the tides of pride and oblivion could be held at bay. The final days of Solon's mission passed in a kind of golden stillness, an afterglow of something sacred fulfilled. Athens, once skeptical, had opened its ears. The circle of the rememberers was growing, and far beyond the marble columns and groves of his homeland, whispers of Atlantis began taking root in new soil. But now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Solon sat alone at the edge of the port, wrapped in a wool cloak, his toes just touching the lapping water. The salt air tugged gently at his hair, and his mind drifted, as it often did, to the temple at Sais, to the warm lamplight, the hush of scrolls being unfurled. The priest's voice, soft and slow, like silk on stone. He wondered if the priest was still alive, if he sat under that same ceiling, telling the story to another wanderer who dared to ask, "What do you know of Atlantis?" A gull cawed above, spiraling into the pale morning sky. Solon smiled faintly. By his side sat the small brass bowl, now filled with rainwater and sea salt. Not the original water, it had long since evaporated, but he replenished it faithfully, treating it more as ritual than relic. He reached for a smooth stone, kissed by the tide, and dropped it gently into the bowl. A ripple bloomed outward, then silence. "Let memory live," he whispered. That day, he presented the final set of scrolls to the city archives. A new compendium, compiled by the Circle, interweaving not only Atlantis' tale, but its applications commentaries on governance, urban planning, philosophy, ritual. It was not enough to tell the story, he realized. People needed to see how its echoes shaped the present. The Scroll of Memory, he called it, and it bore no author's name, because Atlantis belonged to everyone now. At the dedication ceremony, Solon stepped aside, letting younger voices speak. Ilaria recited a hymn in the style of Cretan oral tradition, her voice high and crystalline. Children from local academies sang a chant of the 10 kings, each name followed by a word: Atlas balance, Gediris justice, and so on. As the crowd dispersed, Solon remained behind. The marble steps beneath him were warm with sunlight. He watched as a young boy traced a spiral into the dust with his sandal. "Why do you think the city was in rings?" the boy asked his friend. "Because balance goes in circles," the other replied. "Like the moon." Solon's throat tightened. They understood. He visited the olive grove one last time. A sapling he had planted with his daughter was taller than both of them now. Its branches curled slightly inward, as if hugging the empty space at its center. A perfect ring. His daughter met him there, a scroll under her arm. "I wrote a new story," she said. "Not about Atlantis. About a city called Eliron." He raised an eyebrow. "Huh? And what happens to Eliron?" She grinned. "Nothing bad. It listens. It learns. And it remembers." He ruffled her hair. "Then it will last longer than most." In his final days, Solon declined invitations to high councils. He preferred to walk through markets, talk with shipwrights, sit with fishermen, or listen to old women tell newer versions of the tale. One baker even shaped his loaves like rings. Atlantean bread, he called it. A little dry, but full of care. Solon felt no fear about the future. The world would change, yes, but now it would carry a seed of memory in its pocket. The night before his final journey, wherever that might lead, he returned to the shore. He dug a small hollow in the sand and placed the spiral token inside. Then he pressed the bowl upside down over it, creating a quiet tomb, not of grief, but of gratitude. He whispered a final time, "Let balance guide those who remain." Above him, the stars pulsed faintly, as they had over Atlantis long ago. He closed his eyes, and the tide crept forward to cradle the memory. Now, as our tale draws to a close, let your thoughts settle like soft silt in a calm bay. Picture the silver rings of Atlantis, quiet beneath the ocean, not lost, just resting, sleeping under a blanket of coral and sand. Imagine Solon's gentle footsteps fading into the distance, leaving behind olive groves and scrolls, children singing the names of kings, and cities beginning to listen a little more carefully to the lessons hidden in the wind. Breathe in slowly. Feel the salt in the air, the hush of waves kissing the shore, the cool marble under your fingertips. Let the spiral shape take hold in your mind, not just a symbol of a forgotten civilization, but of time itself. Always turning, always returning. What has been will echo again. Not in the same form, not in the same stone, but in the choices we make. In kindness, in mercy, in remembering what others chose to forget. You are now a keeper of this memory too, so carry it lightly. Perhaps one day, you'll whisper it to someone beside a fire, or plant a tree in a quiet field, or trace a spiral in the sand and think, yes, I remember. And as you drift into sleep, know this: Atlantis is not gone. Its story is alive. And in this stillness, this perfect, glowing quiet, you are part of it now. Sleep well, dear listener. The sea is calm tonight.